In a quiet town where garden fences lined peaceful streets, no one expected violence to bloom beside the roses. But one morning in Brookside, a scream shattered the silence, and a retired soldier was forced to rise again. This isn't just a story about bravery, it's about justice, community, and the moment a neighborhood learned what peace really means and what it takes to protect it. Calvin Mercer had fought many battles in his life, some in deserts thousands of miles away, some in the dark corridors of his own memory. But none prepared him for the moment he watched two strangers drag his wife across their driveway in broad daylight. Brookside, Oregon was supposed to be quiet, a sleepy little town where neighbors waved, sprinklers hissed in rhythm, and garden clubs were the most heated form of debate. That's why Calvin and Naomi had chosen it. After 30 years of service as a combat instructor, Calvin didn't need more noise. Naomi, an artist with a soul as soft as silk, needed only her roses and her morning light. Their home was modest: a white fence, a red porch swing, lavender blooming along the walkway. It had taken years to find this stillness. But stillness, Calvin learned, is not the same as safety. That morning, Naomi had been humming while planting lilies. Calvin was inside, sipping his coffee, flipping through the local paper. It wasn't the scream that caught his attention. It was the sudden silence that followed, the kind that makes the air go thick. He stepped out and saw them. Two men in tan uniforms with hastily stitched patches that read HOA enforcement. One had Naomi by the wrist, the other waving a citation book in her face, accusing her of unauthorized garden structures. Naomi stood her ground. She always did. "I'll comply when you show me identification," she said. Her voice was calm but unwavering. Then came the breaking point. One of them grabbed her by the hair, pulled her toward their truck like she was nothing more than a sack of weeds. That's when Calvin moved. The men never saw it coming. He crossed the yard in 6 steps. No shouts, no warnings, just precision. One man's wrist was disarmed before he realized he'd drawn a weapon. The other was flipped onto the grass with a sound that made the neighbors gasp. Calvin didn't gloat. He didn't threaten. He simply restrained, disarmed, and deconstructed them like training dummies. By the time the police arrived, Calvin had their wallets, phones, and a full confession ready. He handed it all over without saying a word. The men weren't officers. They weren't even security guards. They were convicted felons in stolen uniforms, hired under the table by Douglas Price, the self-appointed chairman of a rogue HOA faction that had been operating unchecked for years. But this wasn't just about Naomi. It turned out Brookside's HOA hadn't held a legitimate election in over a decade. Price had taken over the board after several members resigned, slowly accumulating power. He'd begun issuing citations that never appeared in public records, charging enforcement fees that were paid in cash or digital apps routed to shell accounts. Elderly homeowners were especially targeted, threatened with liens, evictions, fines they couldn't afford, and no one had pushed back. Not until Naomi refused to kneel. It was her camera that cracked everything open. Naomi's garden, always her sanctuary, had been under constant surveillance, mostly to record her roses blooming. But the footage of her assault, clear as day, with GPS-stamped metadata, made the local news, then the state news, then the national feeds. A woman dragged across her own driveway by fake officials. A combat veteran taking them down with surgical precision. The perfect storm of outrage and justice. At the emergency town meeting held days later, Naomi stood before a packed community center. Her wrist was bandaged, but her eyes were sharp. "They tried to make me feel small, but I'm not," she said. "And none of you are. This street, this town, it doesn't belong to a man with a title. It belongs to the people who live here. You and me." Calvin stood silently behind her. He didn't need to speak. His presence was a statement. Douglas Price was arrested the next day, charged with impersonating law enforcement, racketeering, conspiracy, and multiple counts of assault and fraud. Investigations revealed he had hired other ex-cons to do his dirty work in at least 4 other neighborhoods. The HOA board was forced to resign en masse. State authorities launched a full audit of all HOA operations across Oregon. But something more important began to happen in Brookside. Neighbors who had barely spoken for years came together. They shared stories of threats, of quiet compliance, and with those stories came action. Naomi organized Garden Guardians, a civilian group focused on neighborhood safety, education, and rights awareness. Calvin began offering weekly self-defense classes in the local park. Not just combat, but awareness, control, empowerment. Teenagers joined. So did single mothers, retirees, even local teachers. People showed up early. They stayed late. Calvin, who had once lived in the shadows of old wars, now stood in the center of something healing. And people listened. Weeks passed. The media trucks rolled away. Life began to breathe again. But something had shifted permanently. One Saturday evening, during a neighborhood cookout, Naomi stood under the string lights hanging between houses and raised her glass of lemonade. The crowd around her quieted. We always thought peace came from avoiding trouble. But peace isn't passive. Peace is what happens when we stand up not just for ourselves, but for each other. The crowd raised their drinks, and Calvin, the man who never liked crowds or speeches, cracked a smile. In the end, it wasn't the takedown that people remembered. It wasn't the viral video or the court case. It was the feeling that spread through the town like spring after a long frost. A reminder that sometimes the quietest people hold the strongest lines. And that in a world full of systems that forget the human heart, one refusal to kneel can wake a community. Brookside didn't go back to sleep after that, and peace, it stayed, because someone had fought for it.